appreciate the warmth of the resource persons who consented to lead the sessions, and I welcome them to the fraternity of St. Xavier's College. May their insights be flourished through this webinar series. My special words of welcome to MIRZE SANTESSO, Associate Professor in English, University of Georgia, USA, who will lead the opening session of the webinar series. May I pray that this international webinar series instigate and evoke new thoughts and productive actions in order to participate. Wishing you all enjoy sessions. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, sister, for your warm words.
Thank you.
May we now move on. May we now move on to the opening session of our 4 days international webinar series, Eclectics 2020. The speaker of the day, Dr. MIRZE SANTESSO, is an associate professor in English at the University of Georgia, USA. Intensely passionate about her literary and intellectual pursuits, her research interests include post-colonial theory, contemporary British novel, Anglophone fiction, human rights narratives, and Muslim identity. She has a special verb in post-colonial theory and literature with an emphasis on diasporic and immigrant narratives. Focused on championing a standpoint, Dr. ESRA SANTESSO has authored a book entitled Disorientation, Muslim Identity in Contemporary Anglophone Literature, and she is a co-editor of Islam and Postcolonial Literature. Her essays have appeared in a variety of journals, including Religion Literature, Literary Research, The Comparatist, Postcolonial Text, and Postcolonial Intervention. Her interview with Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel Prize winner for literature in 2006, gave her wide acclaim across the globe. I deem it a privilege to listen to such a great personality. With much respect and honor, may I welcome Dr. MIRZE SANTESSO to lead the session on halal literature and appraisal. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. It's a privilege for me to participate in this webinar. So I would like to begin by thanking the Postgraduate Department of English and Research Center at St. Xavier's College. And I would like to extend my warm thanks to Dr. Saomi Mary M. for inviting me to participate in this delightful webinar today. So I want to begin by talking about my research interest, which has brought me to a different kind of a venue called halal fiction, something that I came across a few years ago. And I thought maybe this is something that will catch on, maybe not, but I started looking deeper into it. And for me, it raised a lot of questions, and I would like to share those questions with you. So I'm going to begin by talking very briefly about Muslim writing. Muslim writing, in the broadest sense, has a history that dates back to the 7th century, starting with biographies of the Prophet, as well as the collections of hadiths and sunnahs, which were translated into Western languages as early as the Middle Ages, and maintained a wide European circulation during the Renaissance. Recently, however, with the post-colonial push, contemporary Muslim writing on both sides of the Atlantic has entered into a new literary mainstream to an unprecedented degree, inhabiting various and diverse subfields, such as Black writing, diasporic writing, immigrant fiction, and minority literature. What I would like to talk about today is the emergence of two specific types of Muslim writing that have recently taken root in Britain and in the United States, namely post-secular and halal fiction, which engage with religious themes and subjectivities in distinct and contrasting ways. Now, novelists working in the post-secular Muslim tradition, such as Monica Ali, Leila Halabi, Nadim Aslam, focus specifically on diasporic subjects who feel a need to reconcile between religious heritage and national belonging. The authors of this group are keen to shed light on the disorienting nature of negotiated subjectivity in an alien environment. Yet rather than presenting Islam as an obstacle to integration, with which many critics assumed, they depict religious belief as a source of positive power. In doing so, they emphasize the individual's role in creating a flexible version of Islam that challenges religious hegemonies based on universal dogmas, giving shape to a different kind of Islamic consciousness, one that allows for and indeed strengthens personal autonomy through introspection. Halal fiction, on the other hand, follows a more provocative literary strategy. This vein of Muslim writing is less interested in showing Islam as a source of individual empowerment or in affirming personal agency. Rather, Islam appears as a forceful, indeed irresistible ideology that urges the individual into a general withdrawal from the secular world. In doing so, they attempt to destabilize the novel genre by subverting its secular roots and discarding its dialogic attributes. In the remainder of my talk today, I will turn to two examples from Britain and the United States, namely Layla Abu Layla's Minaret and Zakiya's Footsteps, to further explore the issues at stake. So up to this point, again, my goal was to kind of approach Muslim fiction from two different angles, the post-secular fiction and halal fiction. And I just glossed over how I understand post-secular fiction to be, but I really want to spend most of my time today talking about some of the problems associated with halal fiction. Now, when the Sudanese-British author Layla Abu Layla published her first novel, The Translator, in 1999, she was praised by Feryal Ghazul, among others, for her depiction of Islamic faith and rituals that lead to different modes of living. Quote, Layla Abu Layla delights us by the individual tone she adopts while merging in the fold of the community, showing us that there's plenty of room for an Arab Islamic womanism that is not at all a replica of Western feminisms. For Ghazul, Abu Layla's piety-based gender politics paved the way towards a new literary category, which she labeled halal fiction. Even though Ghazul initially used the term in a tongue-in-cheek manner to describe Abu Layla's portrayal of religiously permissible conduct for pious women, the term quickly caught on among critics and scholars alike as a term that designated a particular type of fiction promoting a religiously sanctioned worldview. Abu Layla's second novel, Minaret, which was published in 2005, culminated her position as a halal writer. Many critics noted how the book subverted conventional expectations about the nature of Islamic religious conversion. Indeed, the protagonist's journey and what happens in the book is that Najwa, who is a young, modern, secular woman from Sudan, relocates to England and becomes a devout, submissive Muslim. And this plot attracted attention for its divergence from the familiar pattern of self-actualization featured in other highly successful works by Muslim Anglophone authors. As opposed to, say, writers such as Hanif Qureshi, Monica Ali, or Moshe Kaf, whose protagonists often move towards a discovery of secular freedom, Abu Layla's protagonist Najwa is pulled into Islam as she tries to cope with her declining social and economic status after her relocation in London. Najwa eventually withdraws from public life to some extent and escapes into anonymity as a domestic worker hired by an Arab family. During this time, she discovers she's attracted to the younger brother of her employer, a practicing Muslim, equally disillusioned with his marginalization in the West. But once that relationship is discovered by the family, Najwa backs away from her love interest and accepts a payment to fund her pilgrimage to Mecca on the condition of ending her affair. So quite a bit of iffy ethics over there. Abu Layla's highbrow fiction finds a more mass-market counterpart a decade later on this side of the Atlantic. Atlanta resident Zakiya's If I Should Speak trilogy, a young adult series that focuses on the Muslim community in the US, was described by bloggers as pure halal entertainment, penned by probably the most established author in Islamic fiction. Books from the trilogy were adopted as a part of the multicultural curriculum in American high schools and were praised for accurately depicting the minority experience through the creation of a compound sense of being the other in race, in religion, and gender. Like Abu Layla, Zakiya treats religion as an overriding component of identity.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. It seems that one of the participants presented their screen and we can no longer see your presentation. Can you present it once again?
Of course. Of course.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
No worries. Is it coming through?
Yes, it's not.
Yes.
It has not yet come.
All right, great.
Hello, ma'am. It has not yet come. Renji, has it come?
Yes. So all good to go.
Not yet.
Okay. So like Layla Abu Layla, Zakiya treats religion as an overriding component of identity. Yes.
It has not come yet, ma'am. The presentation is not visible on the screen.
Okay. I should say.
If it's okay for the participants, it'll be easier if you can pin her screen. That'll work as well.
Yes.
It's possible. It is possible to pin her screen.
Is it coming through right now?
No, ma'am. But it's fine. I guess the participants can pin your screen and they'll be able to view it.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I did say resume. Your screen is still visible to others. Okay. So should I go ahead or?
Yes, ma'am. You can.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So as I was saying, the thing that makes Zakiya and Abu Layla comparable is that both of the authors treat religion as an overriding component of identity and filters female morality through an Islamic lens. In Footsteps, the final installment of the trilogy, we meet Sarah, a white Muslim convert who experienced a crisis of faith after she finds out about her husband's decision to take a second wife. Sarah initially regards this act as an unforgivable betrayal and a personal insult and threatens to leave him. Yet, embarking on a spiritual quest with the help of the other community, she comes to realize that her piety is all she needs to get through this predicament. Soon, she decides to forgive Ishmael and even resolve to actively help him restore his relationship with the other woman. She understands that her initial reaction, her desire for equal standing and a certain level of independence, was wrong. She was the one betraying her husband by questioning his unilateral decision, not the other way around. Over and over, the narrative advocates polygamy as halal and a desirable alternative for the pious women. Oops. Now, as I focus on halal writing, I want to raise two questions. First, does halal as a category destabilize the liberal secular roots of the novel? In other words, Does halal writing provide a fresh platform to discuss faith in realist secular terms, or does it abandon secularism completely to advocate for faith-based subjectivities? Now, when I ask this question, I am not claiming that religion is not a fit topic for the novel. Clearly, there are many examples of novels written about religion, anything ranging from the conversion narratives of the Victorian era to the Christian sentimental literature of the Second and Third Great Awakening. As well, there are great novels that spotlight deeply religious characters, as we see in the works of Gustave Flaubert, Henry Fielding, and Emily Bronte. Rather, what I'm interested in saying is to look at the way we can reconcile the dialogic nature of the novel with works built around theological formal imperatives, as Sadia Abbas puts it, works that openly seek to convert novelistic narrative modes into religious ends. Is halal fiction, in other words, an oxymoron? The second question has to do with the representation of female agency. What type of feminism or womanism does halal fiction really promote? A number of critics, including Marta Cariello, Christine Sizemore, and Peter Morey, praise Minaret for advocating a new type of female subjectivity that repudiates Western models of freedom, thus paving the way towards what some are pleased to call Islamic feminism. Women like Najwa, according to Munir Kouziam, invite us to challenge the normative feminist assumptions about women's agency by showing the futility of binary terms of resistance and subordination. Since Najwa chooses to embrace Islam on her own accord, the argument goes, she engages with a type of feminism that may look different from Western modes of resistance, but nonetheless participates in a feminist construction of gender in line with Islamic ethics. Such reasoning echoes Sabah Mahmoud's redefinition of female agency as a way of inhabiting norms rather than resisting norms, an idea that I will revisit later in the paper. For now, suffice it to say that equating feminism with conformity gets us in murky waters. If there's no resistance to structures that keep women in subordinate positions, can there really be feminism, Islamic or otherwise? Are we prepared to accept women choosing subordinate positions as feminists? Can freedom from freedom be deemed as a viable feminist stance? My reading of Zakiya and Abu Layla contests such interpretations. Rather, I make the case that the representation of the two protagonists as self-negating beings who willfully capitulate their agency, prove their unwavering piety, somewhat ironically upholds the Orientalist and imperialist versions of Islam, and in particular, plays to Western notions of the submissive Muslim woman. Now, for the remainder of the paper, I will talk about two major categories. One is going to be secularism, and the other one, I'm going to get a glimpse of Islamic feminism, and then I'm going to conclude my paper. So the delicate balance between secularism, liberalism, and dialogism that marks most traditional realist novels is complicated once religion is incorporated not only as a thematic arc, but as a structural scheme intended, again, to follow Sadia Abbas's words, to make every aspect of the novel evidence of the workings of Allah. For Salman Rushdie, whose works prominently feature religion, religious discourse and literary aesthetics occupies separate spheres. Quote, whereas religion seeks to privilege one language above all others, one set of values above all others, one text above all others, the novel has always been about the way in which different languages, values, and narratives quarrel. For him, this critical act of separation essentially marks the novel as a secular genre, an idea that surfaces repeatedly in the works of the early 20th century theorists of the novel. Anam Bahtin, Ian Watt, George Lukács all point to the indissoluble link between the realist novel and secular thought. According to what, for example? The rise of the novel coincides with the rise of the modern secular man for whom the pursuit of truth is conceived as a wholly individual matter, logically independent of the tradition of past thought. Theological imperatives are therefore not central to the novel and may indeed run counter to the aims of the genre. What the realist novel does best is to capture and represent this form of consciousness, secular consciousness, with all its triumphs and failures. And when religion is introduced as an integral part of a secular novel, it is generally done without privileging a transcendental truth that invalidates the significance of all other social and economic systems. So at the heart of this question then is the difference between monologism and dialogism. For Bakhtin, the novel represents multiple types of consciousness to articulate a range of ideological positions. His formulation of dialogic ontology rests on the existence of this assemblage that leads to coexistential ethics. In a dialogic environment, truth becomes something negotiated and debated rather than something that is accepted coming from high above. For a majority of critics, then, the truth function of a religious text, coupled with its internally closed, divinely inspired commandments, remain at odds with the dialogic nature of the novel. In halal writing, the secular roots of the novel are pushed aside, not because halal prioritizes faith-based subjectivity, but because it silences dialogism by promoting a single worldview that resists narrative quarrel, to circle back to Rushdie. In Minaret, for example, we see Najwa shying away from connecting with the other women who attends Quranic lessons at the mosque. She realizes that while she enjoys taking tajweed lessons, lessons that teach the correct pronunciation of the Quran by doing a lot of repetition, she dislikes ijtihad lessons, which is using reason to find solutions to a problem. Here's a quote for us to consider. The sisters, especially the young British-born ones and the converts, like to discuss and give their opinions, but I become fragmented and deflated in discussions. I never know which point of view I support. I find myself agreeing with whoever is speaking or with the one I like the best, end quote. Najwa finds assurance in the monologic structure of religion and does not reach out to others to engage in critical exchanges. For her, the dialogic energy and curiosity of Western Muslims is destructive and vaguely vulgar. She's content with adopting a religious persona based on a mechanistic performance of piety. Her disregard for exchange eventually pushes her towards a fundamentalist understanding of spirituality that resists personal reflection and reciprocal interpretation. And Abu Layla herself does nothing to critique such an absence outside of her novels. In an interview with Charles Larson, she states, and I quote, "I want to write fiction that reflects Islamic logic, fictional worlds where cause and effect are governed by Muslim rather than non-Muslim rationale." Abu Layla has a clear agenda. Her voluntary erasure of dissent closes all doors to provocative antagonisms. Footsteps similarly displaces dialogism with religious didacticism. After Sarah finds out about her husband's desire to take a second wife, she entertains the idea of leaving him. However, the other women in the novel quickly rebuke her for her selfishness. Her friend, Nusabai, encourages her to be patient and to remain inert. Quote, "Dua, faith, patience, and most importantly, prayer. If nothing else, polygamy teaches you to love for Allah's sake and to be grateful for his favors. Without either one of these, we have no hope." At another point, Nusabai's plea for forbearance turns into full advocacy. I think in this world, polygamy is going to become a fact of life for Muslims, she says. The good men are few, and the women are many, and it's only going to get worse as we approach the day of judgment. There's an effort here to equate polygamy with piety, implying that that a true Muslim woman would not be bothered by a ritual sanctioned by the Prophet himself. But there's an even more troubling judgment here about female autonomy. By encouraging inaction through passive submission to Allah, Nusabai dismisses Sarah's feelings, discards her individuality, and reduces her to silence. There's no exchange here, no dialogic argument, no narrative quarrel. And nothing summarizes Zakia's resistance to dialogism better than her defense of polygamy that she offered in her blog. Quote, polygamy is something inside of the Quran. You don't have to live it, but it's something that Allah allows it, so it must be good. So that took me on a journey of soul searching, and I began to see with my heart instead of my eyes, because that's how we see. So be careful when you always see negativity in something halal. The problem is your heart, not the situation. If you cannot see the beauty of polygamy, then you have a heart problem. It is in the Quran, so it must be good, is precisely the type of sensibility that resists dialogic exploration. In this case, even questioning polygamy is automatically dismissed as a sign of moral transgression. The silencing of dissent essentially negates the power of the autonomous individual and creates a clear tension between the liberal realist novel tradition and halal writing. While the novel commits to polyvocality to facilitate empathy, halal writing finds its strength in acting as propaganda or celebrations of dogma. Now I'm going to quickly move on to Islamic feminism before I conclude my paper. So before I say anything about feminism, let me just go ahead and acknowledge the fact that there is no one way to be a feminist. Feminists need not follow any one particular ideology or adopt any particular belief sets. But when secularism is dismissed for the sake of piety and dialogism is compromised on a structural level, it is likely that the feminist possibilities of a text are diminished. Abu Layla.
Isn't.
Excuse me?
Ma'am, you may continue, ma'am. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, no problem. No problem. I thought there was a question. Okay, so Abu Layla and Zakiya have been critically celebrated as pioneers for promoting an Islamic model of feminism, but we also have to consider the ways in which their texts advocate for a limiting of female agency. There's a particular moment in Minaret which I would like to focus on briefly. So this is the moment when Najwa decides to veil herself. Obviously, there is abundant discussion in academic circles about the Islamic veil and what it represents. Suffice it to say that the veil is a vexed question. In certain contexts, putting on the veil might be seen as a feminist act. In others, it is removing the piece of clothing that marks a woman as a newborn feminist. But regardless of whether a woman is putting on or taking off the hijab, for it to be considered a feminist act, it seems to me that the enterprise has to bring some sort of empowerment to the individual and display a rejection of power structures that restrict women's participation in public and political discourse. As Anwar Majid points out, quote, whether veiled or not, women's conditions are determined not by the clothes they wear, but by the degree to which they manage to forge an identity for themselves outside the often male-constructed discourses of modernity or religious authenticity, end quote. In Minaret, there is no such affirmation. Here's how Najwa describes her reaction to her veiled visage. Quote, When I went home, I walked smiling, self-conscious of the new material around my face. I passed the window of a shop, winced at my reflection, but then thought, not bad, not so bad. Around me was a new gentleness. The builders who had leered down at me from scaffoldings couldn't see me anymore. I was invisible, and they were quiet. Now, this is read as a redemptive act by Marta Cariello, who writes that Najwa's decision to wear a headscarf is actually a liberating gesture, in that she openly declares she is no longer going to be signified by the intruding sexualizing gaze, male gaze. Shirin Edwin concurs with that reading as she suggests that Abu Layla describes a dimension of Islamic feminism as the protagonist ostensibly draws justification or motivation for her choices and decisions from Islam. But Najwa's initial reaction to her own reflection contradicts this liberation interpretation. She feels a self-conscious unease, which makes her wince. Certainly it's true that she had been bothered by the way men had gazed at her in a sexual manner. Now she is unacknowledged by them, and their indifference is marked by silence. Her response to this development, I was invisible and they were quiet, is hardly the beginning of a new agency, as Cariello insists. If her now unseen self brings about a new gentleness, it is a gentleness that is not necessarily self-driven, nor even achieved through a spiritual introspection, but instead granted to her by her disappearance from her former and more interactive life, and by external male recognition of her gendered religious identity. In this sense, then, Najwa continues to remain an object whose meaning is fixed by the Western male gaze. Her adoption of the veil is hardly an emancipatory choice or a sophisticated entry into a debate about secularism, or an attempt to revise the West's misconceptions about Muslim women. Rather, it's an attempt to mark her avowed otherness and to depart from debate. The way Najwa is drawn to invisibility and Sarah to silence illustrates a striking irony. Despite their apparent initial interest in correcting Orientals' perceptions of Islam in the West, the pious Muslim women in these two novels embraces gendered subjectivity that plays right into the hands of right-wing interpretations of Islam, as Wael Hassan notes. Taking umbrage to such inimical readings, Abu Layla clarifies her reference to invisibility in another interview. Quote, I think people read it as being invisible in a very negative way. However, I meant it in an entirely positive way, that she was no longer having to put up with the way men were looking at her. And yet, this particular passage, regardless of the author's intent, portrays Najwa not as a socially active and independent Muslim woman, but an escapist who sounds more apologetic than empowered. The problem is not that Najwa decides to convert to Islam, but rather that she emerges as a caricature of the Islamic convert, where voiced reason is forfeited for the sake of silent faith. For all that talk of liberating gestures, her adoption of the veil hardly expresses an emancipatory choice. This is not taking agency, it is relinquishing it. Zakia's writing also participates in these inner contradictions as she upholds and validates patriarchal structures of her construction of Muslim female subjectivity. So much so that at points in the book, she verges on parody. The central character, Ishmael, forcefully defends polygamy as a natural male inclination sanctioned by Islam. His appeal to Sarah reflects several levels of rationalization, each more problematic than the last. He first expresses his desire to take a second wife on the basis of male privilege. Quote, a man needed no compelling reason to marry someone else. Of course, a woman wouldn't understand that. His chauvinism then turns into a condescending emotional appeal. Quote, "It was because he was so pleased with Sarah, so complete with her, so at peace in their relationship, that he wanted the same, even if something only slightly comparable with someone else." His reasoning ends with a reinforcement of his patriarchal control. Quote, "He couldn't imagine Sarah without him, single, available to someone else. He would lose his mind." So collectively, these quotes illustrate Ishmael's naturalization of patriarchal authority and his conception of female agency as something that can only be tolerated so long as women remain in line with certain patriarchal Islamic principles. And what is most striking is that Ishmael's positions are not satirized or condemned or even treated as suspect. These appeals, which seem to endorse a masculinist version of Islam that leaves no room for female dissent, are presented as fundamentally reasonable. By the logic of the novel, Sarah has no choice but to surrender her agency, not only to male authority, but also to the authority of women protecting patriarchy. As Hassan argues, this is a push towards a complete disavowal of personal liberty as incompatible with Islam, of feminism as a secular and godless ideology, of individual agency in favor of an all-encompassing notion of predetermination and of political agency. This is not feminism, nor an Islamic version of feminism. So, to conclude, when I was writing this paper, I found myself thinking about C.E. Rashid's inescapable question. Are we forming any sort of conversation when we speak about Muslims in an ostensibly secular academic setting? Put that way, probably not. But it seems just as important to ask whether authors can speak for Islam effectively when the version of Islam represented in their works closes all possibility of dialogue, thus constructing a futile binary between halal writing and non-halal writing, perhaps a sort of writing that we could label as haram writing. Now, when I was growing up in Istanbul, Turkey, the veil was banned by the liberal regime, which feared creeping Islamism, a growing promotion of Sharia over the secular constitution. To prevent the veil from becoming a rallying symbol, the Higher Education Authority announced in 1982 its policy to remove female students with headscarves from university lecture halls. This pronouncement was supported by the Supreme Administrative Court, which asserted that beyond being a mere innocent practice, wearing the headscarf is in the process of becoming a symbol of a vision that is contrary to the freedoms of women and the fundamental principles of the Republic. Now, this is problematic. At that time, people like my mother, working at universities as academics, who believed in upholding democratic rights for women to have access to education regardless of their political views, directly defied the government's decree by refusing to remove female students with headscarves. Some of these academics later became subjects of investigations due to their resistance to comply. But for them, allowing hijabi students in the classroom was not only a matter of human rights, but also a way to empower them through education, to help them make informed decisions on their own terms. Hijab, in other words, had become a feminist issue. Today, when I go to Istanbul, I step on the subway train, and most of the women wear hijab. And there's increasing pressure for secular women to veil themselves if they want to advance their positions in government. So now, freedom not to wear the hijab has become a feminist issue. That's why I find it interesting to think about recent works emerging in the academy about Islamic feminism. Miriam Cook, Margot Badran, Amina Wadud, Sabah Mahmoud are to name a few of the scholars who have been working in this area. Sabah Mahmoud, for example, looks at the Dawa movement in Egypt in order to redefine agency as the practice of inhabiting norms. Women who gather at the mosque to discuss the Quran against their wishes of their husband, according to Mahmoud, are agents who are engaged in practices of self-realization by inhabiting peculiar forms in their daily lives. This is not freedom performed through acts of subversion of given norms, but freedom as a practice of belonging. Now, while Mahmoud deserves praise for her resolve to think about agency outside the Western norms, she still, to my mind, doesn't present a viable model for pious feminism, primarily because she fails to account for community or domestic pressures or religious dogmatism. As we see in Footsteps, ritualized readings of the Quran can quickly become ceremonial faux discoveries of established truths and doctrine, and way to consolidate collective identity. In the end, Najwa and Sarah are inevitably drawn into a peculiarly harsh and anti-liberal version of Muslim femininity as they participate in women's communities. So, to conclude, with this in mind, I see a clear divergence between post-secular Muslim writing, which invites Islam as a legitimate form of inquiry explored through the dialogic lens of the novel, and halal writing, which openly rejects and actively destroys the foundational features of the genre in its effort to promote halal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Halal literature, halal writing is always a new, is a kind of genre that is unfamiliar for most of us. It was not familiar for me at least. So I'm so happy that I could listen to such a presentation where I got an idea about what halal literature is, what that particular genre is. And we know that the politics of representation is always a problematic area. Like, it is always difficult to define and redefine the agency. It is again difficult to establish the personal identities in all these arenas. The kind of like othering is always there. So we got an idea, a very good idea about halal literature and the problematics that are related to halal fiction. And so thank you for such a wonderful presentation. We have some doubts from the participants. May I read it out?
Absolutely, please do.
Okay. There is a question from Ranjana Malhotra. What about the liberal Muslim writers? How do they stand in the context of halal literature?
So that is the kind of distinction that I want to make at the beginning of my presentation by differentiating between post-secular writing, which legitimizes Islam, Islamic faith, Islamic rituals, but it does that in a less of a propaganda and dogmatic way and more of an invitation to debate and open-mindedness and critical engagement. So I would say, I don't know whether I would call that a liberal vein of Muslim writing. For me, it's post-secular because, again, it pays attention to religion, but it doesn't isolate religion as the overriding component of identity. It imagines religion and religious identity in a network of different kinds of discourses that include gender identity, class identity, national belonging, and so forth. So again, I'm not sure whether I would call that liberal vein of Muslim writing, but definitely a post-secular type of writing that acknowledges the importance of religion and sees that as an empowering component, but one of many components of identity. And for me, the problem with halal is not that it's inviting religion, but it's doing that in such a constricted way that religion becomes an escape and not an empowerment for these Muslim women. I lost your audio.
For me, your audio is on. For me, your audio is on.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Ma'am, another question from P. Ashik. have you come across any male writer that can be put in the halal literature genre?
I have not, actually. I am still seeking, looking at different kinds of examples of halal literature. But I think there's a very interesting convergence between halal writing and female identity, especially when it comes to Muslim women's identities. So it's not very surprising to me that male writers are not necessarily invested in this kind of thinking. But I'm very happy to be corrected. So if there's any kind of male halal writers out there, please do send them my way.
Okay. Another question from Bibin Ma'am. Since you have pointed out feminism and halal literature, I would like to know your take on masculinity and halal literature and queer literature and halal literature.
Masculinity and halal literature and?
Queer writing and halal writing.
So I would say in halal literature, masculinity is presented in very stereotypical, conventional ways, in the sense that patriarchy is resurrected as a way to think about female agency in very submissive and subjugated norms. So rather than, I think, and that's one of the problems that I find with halal literature, which is rather than correcting these kinds of misconceptions, it kind of resurrects the Orientalist and imperialist biases that already exist in the West about Islam. So masculinity can become very toxic in halal literature, that it becomes a way of dismissing and drowning women's voices, because any kind of dissent is met with very serious pushback from the male patriarchy. But also one other thing that I would add to this, it's not just the men of the community that uphold that sort of patriarchy, but it's the women who are kind of the unofficial surveillors of the community to make sure that the other women are acting in line with that kind of thinking. So it's not just masculinity that is responsible for pushing women down, but it's the other women who participate in that kind of suppression to make sure that nobody is able to leave the norms, and they draw a very strict parameter about the idea of being a woman, a Muslim woman. So anyone who transgresses from that is easily discarded and ostracized by the community of women too. So it's not just a question of masculinity, but it's about who is participating to resurrect the patriarchal norms within the society. It's men and women alike in most of the cases.
Thank you, ma'am. Another question from Rashida Madani. Could you please repeat the major writers who work on this particular area?
In halal writing?
Yeah, major writers in halal writing.
So the two examples that I used, Layla, Abu Layla, and Zakiya, are the ones that kind of have been talked about as halal writers by many critics. So some of the people that you might be interested in looking at would be Peter Mori has a brilliant essay on halal writing. Fadia Fakir, who's an author herself, she talks about, she doesn't necessarily participate in halal writing, but she talks about the merits of halal writing herself. And Lucinda Nunes is a British scholar who evaluates the merits of halal writing as well. And Claire Chambers is a critic who has written and published about halal writing. And for me, most of the Western thinkers are really pushing for halal to sound feminist. And again, I have a problem with that kind of unmediated feminism becoming like the staple to say, oh, it's feminism, but it's a different kind of feminism. But if there's no impetus for gender rights, for gender equality, to call it Islamic feminism is pretty short-sighted for me.
Thank you, ma'am. There is a question from Papi Naidu. Are there any halal writers? Do you know any halal writers from India?
I do not know any halal writers from India. No. I think one of the things about halal writing is that it participates in Salafi understanding of Islam, which is a much more conservative version of Islam that originated in Africa. So I'm not surprised that there aren't a lot of examples coming from India. I am told that there are some young adult fiction coming from Pakistan that can be considered halal, but I wasn't able to read them because they're not translated into English. So again, young adult literature coming from Pakistan might be considered as such, but I have to go with the word of my colleague here at Georgia rather than being able to evaluate that myself. But again, Salafism is about this movement that tries to purify religion. The whole movement is invested in the idea of going back to the early days of Islam, the way it was being practiced by the Prophet. And because Salafism is very closely knit with the African Muslim experience, that most of the examples come from that region.
Yes, ma'am. I do believe that there must be Indian writers in halal literature. They might be coming to the forefront in the coming days. We can believe that.
And that's why it's important that I give this talk, so we can continue the discussion and see how this is going to evolve in the next few years. And I would be very interested in knowing if there's any kind of halal fiction emerging in India.
Yeah, we'll definitely call you when we come across any kind of writing like that. We'll call you, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Another question from Jessie. Other than feminism, what are the other aspects that can be discerned from halal literature?
I think there's a very conscious effort to discard sexual identity as well, that negotiating sexual desire becomes something that is being dismissed and looked down upon, frowned upon. And I think in Minaret, for example, Abu Layla's Minaret, there's a very interesting sequence. The timing is very suspect. Najwa has a love interest, and she dates this man for a long time in England. He's somebody that she knows from Sudan. They used to go to school together. But the moment he rejects her, the moment he says, actually, I'm going to marry someone else that my family deems more fit, is the moment Najwa decides to put on the veil. So in a way, in addition to having some kind of feminist or anti-feminist tendencies, that kind of sexual desire, being the object of desire, is being looked down and frowned upon in the halal fiction, and it's completely silenced throughout the rest of the narrative. There is no looking back. There is no kind of a mourning of a loss of a loved one. She just moves on. And she meets him in another instance, and she says, I really wonder what he will think about me now that I'm a veiled woman and I'm a Muslim. So it really shows that there's something else going on here, that the veil becomes a way to push back against her sexual desire.
Okay, ma'am. Yet another question from Salwa Khashing. Is halal writing focused only on Islamic writing?
Yes, it is about recognizing the importance of religious identity, especially Islamic identity, and creating a version of womanism that is based on relinquishing agency and dismissing autonomy. And it's very much in line with the Quranic principles. I am not saying that the Quran is followed to the T, but the Quranic principles are used as a way to create some sort of propaganda for a submissive form of womanism in halal fiction. So it's very much embedded in Islam. That is not to say other types of conservative writings do not exist within a Christian or a Jewish context, but the way halal is used as a term is very much connected to the Islamic identity.
Okay, ma'am. We have some viewers on YouTube. So there is a question from YouTube chat box. Can we consider Thermina Durrani from Pakistan as halal writer? Thermina Durrani.
Tamina
Durrani.
I am sorry, I am not familiar with the author.
Okay, ma'am. There is a question from P. Ashik. How does halal literature intersect with other identities like ethnic, racial, etc.?
So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is because both of these texts resurrect a Salafist understanding of Islam, geographically it's connected to more African tradition, African ethnicity. In terms of national belonging, it is also curious to me that both of these writers are diasporic writers. That Abu Layla is from Sudan originally, but now she lives in Scotland, in Aberdeen. And Zakiya is born to immigrant parents, and you know, that she's considered as one of the most important voices emerging from the Muslim diaspora in the United States. So I think one of the questions that they raise is, how do we negotiate our Muslim identity with national belonging? In other words, can we be legitimately considered as British Muslims, as Muslim Americans? And that to me is a kind of a underscored theme in these halal novels, which talk about not only gender, not only about patriarchy, but also about national belonging. So both Abu Layla and Zakiya would say, we have to have a much more diverse understanding of national belonging. And I think this is a very important thing, that there's a push for multiculturalism, multi-ethnic literature in many of the different kinds of Western curricula. And I think this is very important. What is problematic to me is Zakiya's book, Footsteps, has become a staple in multicultural education in America. And when students read that, they will have a very specific understanding of Islam, and they're going to treat that as a token understanding. In other words, what they will be exposed to in terms of Islam will be defined by a very conservative idea pushed forward by Zakiya. And I think that's going to be very problematic to promote that kind of multiculturalism.
Thank you, ma'am. There is such another question which is so interesting. Do you think that both halal literature and Islamic feminism can contribute to liberation and empowerment of women? Does halal literature stand as a tool to justify patriarchal hegemonic forces within religion?
Yeah, I agree. I think halal literature does justify those patriarchal impetus in Islamic religion. But Islamic feminism, I mean, that's something to watch for, right? I mean, I always have a little bit of a moment of hesitation when I talk about Islamic feminism, as if like Islam and feminism are so incompatible with each other that I have to have that adjective at the beginning of feminism. But I think for the time being, it's an important conflation between religion and feminism. And I think what has been happening recently in scholarship, Muslim scholarship, and this real re-engagement with autonomy and female voice is very important. So I think they are diametrically opposed to one another. That halal fiction tries to looks feminist for some Western critics, but it really does disservice to Islamic feminism. Islamic feminism, on the other hand, and again, I'm not saying this is a term that doesn't have any kind of problems. I mean, we don't talk about Jewish feminism, right? We don't talk about Christian feminism. So why talk about Islamic feminism? But it's because people have such a stereotypical and narrow understanding of female subjectivity connected to Islam that I think this term is valuable and has merit to be able to start a discussion about the fact that there's a very important activist movement coming from many Muslim societies that is focused on gender equality, on women's rights, on different understandings of motherhood, I think this is a term that is going to have a lot of importance and merit in the future.
Okay, ma'am. There is a question from Ramkripa Prasad. Is the practice of halal not against the feminism in the modern age?
I mean, it depends. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Can we think about halal as a feminist text? Many people do. I just don't agree that it is. What I would like to see in literature that promotes female agency is if Najwa, for example, came to England and she became a Muslim and she said, and I love it. I feel so empowered by it. And I learned something from it. And I'm able to take on the world and the challenges by turning to my spiritual awakening. Perfect. But it's the withdrawal from the secular world. She becomes invisible. She doesn't want to go out. She restricts her public appearance. She restricts her friends. She has no friends. And she says, in fact, the novel begins, the first words are, I have come down in the world. So if being a Muslim is coming down in the world, I wonder how we can think about it as a form of empowerment and a different kind of feminism. And to me, that kind of understanding of Muslim agency is very problematic. It's very much in line with Orientalist and imperialist versions of Islam that is being accepted by the West.
Okay, ma'am. Shreya Rai asks, what is the future of research on halal branding? How can you brand halal literature?
I honestly thought when I first saw the term, I was like, oh my gosh, it must be a joke. Like somebody is, using this in an ironic manner. And again, Farial Ghazul, who's the first person who used that term, said it in a very tongue-in-cheek manner. But again, look at the scholarship coming from England, where Muslim writing is so prominent. Amina Yakin, Fadia Fakir, Peter Morey, Lucinda News, Claire Chambers, just to name a few. These are all the people that are talking about halal writing academically. So what's the future? It's only going to expand. I'm already in conversation with you as you tell me that it's going to emerge in India. Somebody else asked about Pakistani literature, whether that particular author could be considered as halal. So I think this is something that is going to take on. Even though my examples might be limited at the moment, I think as a movement, it's just going to grow. It's such an interesting way of exploring the intersection between Islam and literature.
Sure, ma'am. Next, can we find transnational representations in halal literature?
I'm sorry, can we find?
Transnational representations in halal literature.
Yes. As I said earlier, both of these women are looking at diasporic communities in their adopted homes. And when Najwa, for example, goes to the mosque, she pays attention to the fact that there's a very diverse range of ethnicities, races, nations that are being represented. The same thing applies for Zakia's footsteps. When women meet to discuss the Quran at the mosque, it's a multinational diasporic community. So the transnational nuances are certainly there. And it also speaks about the idea of ummah in the Islamic tradition, which is this global membership that is not only restricted to one nation, one ethnicity, one linguist group, but a global understanding of belonging and membership that is very pertinent in the Islamic understanding. So the transnational nuances are certainly there. It acknowledges that Islam is not restricted to one group only, that especially in these diasporic communities, transnational structures become a lot more important and a lot more pronounced.
There is a question from Pavati Papalan. Can Orhan Pamuk's No be considered as a halal fiction?
I would say no. Orhan Pamuk has done an amazing job in Snow. in talking about the challenges that many Muslim women face in rural parts of Turkey. And I think what he's done is to give voice to these women and to say, look, we shouldn't be speaking on their behalf. These women are capable of doing the speaking on their own terms if we let them, if we do not silence them. So rather than trying to subdue those voices, he's really opened up a venue, a literary venue for these women to be heard. So I think it's definitely post-secular, which is the first version of Islamic writing that I mentioned before, which pays attention to religion's importance in negotiating female identity, but it's not halal in the sense that it is not starting to subdue, but it's giving a very legitimate platform for these women to express themselves.
Okay, ma'am. What is the scope of halal and haram literature?
So, to be honest with you, I made that, statement, maybe a sarcastic statement, that there can be some kind of haram literature. It's not something that is theorized, or it's not something that's become mainstream or even marginalized theoretical formulations at all. But haram literature, I really wonder, one of the earlier questions was about the liberal writing in Islam. And I wonder if halal is teaching women to behave, whether haram is something that can be considered Islamic feminism. If women are taking the power within themselves to negotiate an identity, whether that be gender identity, religious identity, national identity, class identity, but if they are empowered to do that on their own without somebody else telling them what to feel and what to do, I wonder from a halal perspective, that kind of feminist writing would be considered as haram. But just my initial thoughts about that there.
A question from P.S. Rao. Can you explain the place of autobiographical element in the area of halal literature?
So both of these works that I looked at are fiction. They are not autobiographical. But I'm trying to think about, recently I became very invested in the idea of graphic novels. And in graphic novels, there's much more of a tendency to talk about, one's life as a Muslim. I mean, one of the books that I can think about is Persepolis, which is an Iranian woman growing up after the Iranian Revolution. And it plays a lot of attention to religious identity, to political discourses that surround that kind of religious awakening within the nation. Could that be considered as halal literature? I think certain parts absolutely could. Is it a definitive form of example of a halal literature? I'm not sure. But, again, my presentation today was much more about the fiction side rather than the autobiographical side. That is not to say autobiographical writing cannot be considered as halal. One thing that I can add is, I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with Shalina Mohammed's Love in a Headscarf. Now, again, that's not strictly halal literature, but it borderlines halal. It's about a Muslim, British Muslim, trying to find love through arranged marriage. It is like a Muslim version of Bridget Jones's Diary. It is very much invested in this autobiographical life writing form. So that's something that would be worth considering in terms of autobiographical writing and its connection with halal.
Baby Ritu Fukhan has a question. Can we consider wearing a hijab symbolic of Islamic patriarchal hegemony, or do Muslim women very often accept it as a more protective gear from male gaze?
This is a very different, it really depends on the context. If a woman wants to wear a headscarf, a woman should be able to wear a headscarf. It is their right. If they want to express themselves, if they want to wear their faith on their bodies, participate in this embodied ritual, absolutely. That is a feminist expression in my mind. Now, if a woman is forced to wear the headscarf, if a woman feels that their lives will be threatened or that they will be ostracized if they do not wear the headscarf, then taking off the headscarf is a feminist expression. And that's why it's very easy sometimes for us to make generalizations about a piece of clothing, like, oh, the veil, it's a symbol of patriarchy. Oh, the veil, it's a symbol of repression. Sometimes it is, sometimes it is not. In Turkey in 1980s, when the veil was banned, I supported my friends' rights to be able to wear the veil. Because again, it's a human rights issue, it's a freedom of expression, and if a woman wants to embrace an embodied practice such as that, so be it. So I think it's the context rather than the piece of clothing itself that determines the feminist tendencies of an act.
There is a question from Vinita Nair. How could you reconcile a critique of essentialism with halal writing, especially in the context of Islamophobia?
Listen, I have been critical of Zakiya and Abu Layla, but that is not to diminish the importance of their work. Any kind of work, especially a lot of Anglophone writing coming from the Muslim world, is a counter narrative to some of the stereotypes that we have seen emerging, especially in the wake of 9/11, right? Even before 9/11, the Muslim stereotypes existed. They were the other, they were the sinister, or the brute. But 9/11 really recontextualized this kind of negative stereotyping for the Muslims. And any kind of writing that comes as an insider's perspective is an important form of writing. And Abu Layla and Zakiya absolutely deserve applause for pioneering this kind of writing. But my worry is that rather than push back against those kinds of essentialist ways of thinking, what they end up doing is to create characters that are completely in line with the caricature of the Muslim woman. And my wish is that they're able to move beyond those stereotypes and to embrace a more humanistic and pluralistic version of womanism that can revive those misconceptions in the West.
There are many questions in the chat box. I think we'll stop with one or two.
Okay.
This is from Devika Nair. Is there a religious propagandist agenda in halal writing?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Is there a religious propagandist agenda in halal writing?
Yes, I would say it's both political propaganda that, again, has very definite, clear-cut gender identity and performance, but it's also didacticism, which is to teach women how to be and how to behave. So both propaganda and didacticism becomes a part of this monologic discourse that is embraced in halal literature. And to me, that's problematic. And, you know, the one way to counter that, again, is to be able to present a more pluralistic understanding of Islamic femininity that can challenge and humanize the figure of the Muslim woman rather than, resurrect those kinds of stereotypes.
The last question, ma'am. Can halal fiction writings be incorporated to the category of post-colonial writings?
Yes, even if it's just a symbol form of thinking about diaspora, which is the offshoot of post-colonial writing, absolutely. I would say it's a subcategory of post-colonial writing. It talks about the global movements and the diasporic movements to begin with. And second of all, again, this idea of providing counter narratives, pushing back against the master narratives is an important impetus in halal. And I think it's with the post-colonial push, the post-colonial resurgence of identity that we come to realize that these subcategories such as Black writing or immigrant writing or minority writing exist. So it's very much in line with what Edward Said said about post-colonial impetus, which is to give permission to the native to speak their own stories or to narrate their own stories. And again, I used the word insider's perspective before. That is not to say that any kind of religious writing has to be done from the perspective of the insider, but I think if the insider perspective is completely missing or absent from mainstream, it's important that they are integrated into a body of writing that is able to speak about the post-colonial need or the desire to give more power to the marginalized and disenfranchised voices.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We'll stop with that particular question. There are many words of appreciation regarding your presentation and about the topic that you have selected for this presentation. And thank you so much, ma'am, for that comprehensive talk on halal literature. We got a deep insight into this particular area.
I also would like to thank you again for your kind invitation and for all those questions. I mean, I am going to be watching this again because there's so many very wonderful questions that I'm going to have to think more about this, kind of expanding my scope of halal literature. But I really hope I put my email address at the beginning of my PowerPoint presentation. I really hope that this is the beginning of a conversation. And I would love to hear from everybody who participated in this webinar. And again, thank you for a wonderful morning. What a way to start the day.
I hope that this would turn to be dialogic in every sense of the word.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Before we conclude, may I invite Dr. Lima Anthony, Head of the Department of English, St. Xavier's College for Women, Aluva, to propose the formal vote of thanks. Over to Lima.
Okay. Thank you, Sami. On behalf of the Department of English and Research Center, I would like to thank Ms. MIRZE SANTESSO for sharing her insights on halal literature. This was indeed a very interesting session. Ma'am, thank you, Ms. SANTESSO, for being part of our webinar. So, next, I would like to thank Dr. Sister Gigi Xavier, our beloved principal, for all the support extended in all our activities. Thank you, dear sister. I thank Dr. Saumi Mary M for organizing a wonderful international webinar series and for bringing all these resource persons. So it has indeed been a very good session and I thank her. I also would like to thank Ms. Ruby Francis, who is the joint coordinator of this webinar series. I place on record the support of all my colleagues behind this webinar series. I also would like to thank all the participants who are interested in all the academic activities of our department. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Lema. And thank you, Dr. ESRA, Mr. SANTESSO. It was such a wonderful experience with you.
Thank you, everyone. And again, let's keep the conversation going.
Yeah,
Thank you,
yes, sure. Thank you.
Thank you.